First, we've got Susan Benesch, the founder and executive director of the Dangerous Speech Project, and also one of the leading organizers of the Coalition for Independent Tech Research, and Nora Benavidez, who is the senior counsel and director of digital justice and digital rights at Free Press. And this panel, as you know, is about AI as a threat to democracy and free thought. Now, it doesn't have to be, but it is because of the current landscape that we're in. And if we think about democracy, of course, we can think about elections, so let's cover that. But more broadly, democracy is about equality, it's about fairness, transparency, and accountability, and fundamentally about our free will to engage in the democratic process, and liberal democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of thought. It is essential to human dignity, individuality, decisional autonomy, and due process. And I think that the situation we're in right now is that general artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence in particular is undermining the foundation of these core models. It's weakening institutions of democracy, the press, surely among the leading of those, and it is exacerbating online disinformation, the destruction of news, the closing of civic space. So, let's delve into some of those. And I think I want to start to hear from both of you about the issue of disinformation, about our information environment and information integrity, because I think that is what a lot of people see as the primary threat from generative AI, right? The ability to easily create information. And here we're talking about the application level of AI, right? So, Susan, in your work, you have studied what you call dangerous speech and disinformation, propaganda, hate speech. What are the dangers posed by AI and where we are right now to democracy and free thought?
First of all, it's lovely to be here, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with these two magnificent people and also with the rest of you. AI is a constellation of spectacular tools for communicating and doing some other things, but in this context, for communicating extremely effectively. So that means that all of the kinds of malevolent communication that we have been seeing now for years that have created a kind of collective moral panic about online communication are now becoming more and more effective. Just to give one example, there will be 40 significant national elections next year in 2024, culminating in the United States national election. But there will be these vastly important elections all over the world. AI will make it frighteningly easy for someone to create a fake video, making it look as if an election official has canceled the elections, announced that the electoral system is flawed or corrupt, has been taken over by the opposite side, any number of forms of disinformation that I would call dangerous speech, because they have, unfortunately, great capacity to inspire violence, to inspire collective violence. An event like that, which again would be quite easy to bring about, you can imagine that an announcement by someone who seems to be a person in authority, a key actor in the democratic system of a country or a state, let's say, can not only completely disrupt an election, but also significantly erode the faith of a population in the democratic process itself. Once you are convinced that a fake is real, you will, of course, have greater difficulty distinguishing between what is fake and what is real, and feel that you can't have a proper grip on the truth as it is being offered apparently by those who govern.
And this erosion of the ability or even maybe desire to distinguish between truth and fiction is also, I think, about the role that communication plays in identity formation and group formation, and in your ability to understand the past and the present and the future. And so, as we head into these elections, Nora, you work at Free Press, which has been a staunch defender of press freedom around the world. And we know that one of the biggest institutions that is under threat when it comes to democratic governance is the press. And in the information environment that Susan is, describing, full of fake videos, fake content, there's an information glut, but also the danger of reporters, reporting on these types of things. So then the issue of authenticity and provenance comes into play. How are you thinking about the dangers and the threats to democracy and journalism in particular as we head into, this election cycle globally?
Well, like Susan said, it's wonderful to be here with all of you. We have the privilege of being the first panel, so we get to say all the fun stuff and get it out of the way, and then you hear it again and you say, oh, yeah, Nora and Susan said that. They were so on it. So it's wonderful to be here. Susan is a luminary in the field, and Courtney and I go so far back. So we've talked about all range of press freedom and democratic issues. There's this really weird tension that we are always fighting. And it's the relationship between the online world and the real world. So many in the tech sector, even lawmakers, other sectors will say, there really isn't that much of a relationship. What happens online, it's online. And one of the issues that researchers and tech accountability experts are trying to push back against is that premise. And there are always examples that would debunk that premise, but they're usually in crisis moments, and they're usually too late for the sectors that could mitigate those harms to actually implement them. When it then comes to the ways that our journalistic sector is digesting what happens online, the porous relationship there is very dangerous in those kinds of crisis moments. A great example is what's happening now in the Middle East. So many online originating lies and low quality, inauthenticated pieces of content and narratives have moved into our mainstream media. CNN, the LA Times, other news outlets have had to retract and or correct stories that originated online that they cite to and say, this is happening in Israel or in Gaza. And that's just one example of a very, very combustible crisis moment where mainstream media is taking in those junk, low quality, and lies. In any democratic moment that Susan describes, the threat is more acute. And I worry that journalists are not equipped right now to handle the next 40 elections that we're going to see over the coming year. For a number of reasons. One, there is always the concern for journalists now that AI is going to take their jobs. That's everyone's concern. AI is going to take my job, which is really not true. But people who know how to use AI will eventually take all of our jobs. So we have to be able to understand the innovative and exciting reasons to embrace certain aspects of AI. But also there's really, I think, Courtney, to your question, something else here, which is about trust. And we're always circling the issue of trust, because in our line of work, to talk about dangerous speech or lies, we have to talk about what it feels like for the person receiving that content. It has very real eroding effect on individuals, and played out over societies, people are less and less likely to engage, which includes the trust that we would otherwise bestow upon other media, not just social media, but mainstream media.
And I mean, so to this end, the issue of declining trust, crisis of trust, the disinformation issues, deep fakes, these are actually not new problems, right? We've already seen how the monopolization of a handful of tech platforms has undermined the economic basis for the production of quality information through journalism. We have seen a decline in trust accompanied by the rise and power of the platforms. And we know, for example, that there are discriminatory impacts and biases baked into the algorithmic design of many of these systems. So if we think about the opacity of these algorithms, the kind of psychographic persuasion and manipulation that's available through behavioral advertising, micro-targeting, the manipulation of psychological and social behavior that distorts, again, free will and free thought. How are we going to see generative AI amplify or exacerbate these? And Susan, do you want to take that first?
Sure. In lots of ways. Take a long time to discuss in detail. Let me give you an example. Content moderation. That's something that corporations are doing on a scale much, much, much larger than any government is doing, including China, by the way, or ever has done. So corporations are controlling human communication to an almost unimaginable degree and at an almost unimaginable scale. Meta, for example, has thousands and thousands and thousands of underpaid, psychologically overwhelmed, subcontracted people watching. We used to say beheading videos, watching all kinds of absolutely awful content and making very quick decisions whether to take that content down or leave it up. That's a terrible system in all kinds of ways for its impact on people, as I just implied, for the fact that they only get to the content in many cases after it has already done a lot of damage. Though prior censorship, says this journalist and lawyer, would be an absolutely awful idea. Now along comes AI. So you're a corporation. You're paying not nearly enough money, but you're paying quite a lot of money to people to do this awful job of content moderation. So increasingly, of course, you hand it over to the algorithms, which are now more and more often powered by large language models, which is a form of AI that allows you to, among other things, detect certain kinds of content a little bit more effectively than your previous algorithms could do it. And you can argue that now this AI is at least as effective as people at detecting certain kinds of content and making decisions.
But we also know that these algorithms, the large language models in particular, embed certain biases. So there have been studies that show, the llama model from, Meta is more conservative than another model, or the embedding of misogyny and extremism. So, what are the implications kind of beyond the individualized content, like the systems that are being set up and on which all of these application level, applications are being designed are closed and non-transparent for the most part, and embed, again, a lot of the kind of data that is used to feed this is based on data that we don't know what it is about, and that embed certain biases. So, Nora, how are you thinking about this as you think about, press freedom, freedom of expression? What does the dominance of a handful of corporate actors creating the foundation models on which we're trying to build these systems?
Well, to be any member of society nowadays, you have to be online. That's just really a fact. And most of what we are doing produces pieces of information that social media companies, as well as other digital services, gather in the millions and millions and millions. All of those data points are put together for AI, for various automated tools to make a number of decisions for these companies. In a few different contexts, what does this look like? Let's take something like the healthcare realm. In the United States, an algorithm that distributes patients to hospitals has given preferential treatment to white patients, despite Black patients being equally, if not more ill. That's just one example over here. In, let's say, the housing realm, Facebook, now Meta, has settled a lawsuit with the Department of Justice, we may talk about it later today, in which Facebook was found to place users into cohorts based on the composite or sort of curated identity that it creates from its algorithm that then distributes housing and other advertisements to users. It's a pretty well-known settlement, and we're currently litigating a different set of similar issues in the Vargas v. Facebook case, if anyone wants to look it up. Those are, again, sort of these discriminatory or biased harms. And then most important, in my opinion, for this discussion is thinking of the democracy and voting realm. And we know from the last several elections, even here in the United States, that algorithms employed by social media companies like Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube have preferential treatment in some ways, particularly targeting Black, Latino, and Native American users who would be voters with the kind of content that would dissuade them from voting. And in particular for voters of color, content that would dissuade them because of potential violence, potential intimidation at the polls. So there's this large set of data we're giving, pieces of information, we're just sort of like signing away because we all have to, have the exact Uber location because we want to get picked up in the best spot and not have to walk half a block. But all of the pieces of data that we are giving have downstream impact for our offline reality and for the ways that we would connect with democracy. So as it relates then to this 40 elections around the world, we are in an unprecedented moment, which is not to somehow say it in this fun, arbitrary way. These are very real harms that will ultimately affect how people make decisions and attitudinal shifts in their voting in other ways that they would connect with each other.
And these aren't hypothetical because we know that Facebook, many years ago rolled out voting stickers and it changed people's behaviors. I do want to note if anyone has a question, my colleague Audrey in the back, you can give her a note card and we'll take those at the end if there are any. But, I want to go to this point about the power that platforms have to potentially influence elections, but other parts of democracy, to influence, people's perception of things. And this isn't to say that people are, automatons and, don't have any free will, but we have seen evidence that the way that social media enables micro-targeting and psychographic profiling does have behavioral change. How do you think generative AI, again, is going to make this even more concerning from the perspective of democratic governance? We have no transparency into these algorithms. We have no transparency into what social media platforms are doing, much less how advertising platforms are allowing different groups, whether it's foreign adversaries or people wanting to make a buck. How are you thinking about these within the framework of the dangers that we're facing?
With a lot of anxiety. May I just pick up your point, Courtney, that freedom of expression is vital for democratic life, obviously, for individuals and for collectives. In the United States, our law separates the freedom to speak, or really the freedom to get other people to read or listen to what you have to say, which is freedom of speech. We separate that from the freedom to receive information. In fact, it's a two-way process, both of which are absolutely vital for freedom of expression itself, but particularly also for democratic life. It is mind-boggling and really worrisome to me that we have no idea whether the platforms are governing the speech of different groups of people in similar ways. There is a body called the Oversight Board, originally called the Facebook Oversight Board, that then Facebook launched a couple of years ago with great fanfare. They were informally called the Supreme Court of Facebook at first, and now Zuckerberg and others have retreated from that moniker. Quite like the United States Supreme Court, that body has decided very few cases. I think it's finally up to close to 50 cases.
But they have no insight into the algorithms, the
No insight, no access to data about algorithms, and in fact, no access to data at scale. They look at one case at a time, one decision to take down a specific piece of content or an account. The sorts of questions that I'm referring to, like if women and men post similar content, is it taken down at the same rate? If Hindus and Muslims in India, one of those countries that's about to have a major election in 2024, are posting similar content, is it taken down at the same rate? If Israelis and Palestinians post similar content, is that, et cetera, et cetera. We claim to care about equality and discrimination at this time in history. How is it possible that we are not even asking those questions? We need a systematic, independent, non-government, non-corporate mechanism for auditing what the platforms are doing.
And Susan, you're part of this independent tech research group, which includes researchers who have tried to gather some of that data and then are being targeted by tech platforms. I think some are being sued. They've had access to APIs cut off. So, can you tell us just a little bit about the difficulties, given again the power of platforms, their wealth? They can sue you. They can, they control access.
Sure.
How are you fighting back?
Well, first of all, just to be very clear, I have this dream of a body of independent auditors, and I hope it's not just a dream; it is a proposal. A body of professional independent auditors who would watch and scrutinize what the tech companies are doing, just as in any industry you can think of whose goods and services significantly both benefit and can harm the public, there is always some kind of independent oversight. Think of consumer protection. You can't run a slaughterhouse or manufacture cars, for example, without somebody coming and watching what you're doing.
But you also need a license. So do you think that we should be requiring licenses for AI companies?
You don't need a license to do all of the sorts of things I'm imagining or referring to in different industries. But just to make sure that I also answer your question, Courtney, about the Coalition for Independent Technology Research, that's separate in my view. I don't think we should rely on whistleblowers or journalists or independent researchers to do systematic oversight. It's a different thing. The researchers are absolutely vital to protect the public interest, since we can't expect corporations to operate on behalf of the public or in the public interest. Sometimes they are more or less inclined to damage public interest or help it, but they're not nonprofits, clearly. So researchers, including academics and journalists and independent researchers, have in various ways tried to study what the platforms, what the tech companies are doing. The companies themselves have gotten in the way terribly. I think perhaps Laura Edelson is here. She and her brilliant work that was very abruptly shut down by Facebook inspired us to start the Coalition for Independent Technology Research 2 years ago.
We'll also be hearing from Julia Angwin, whose work as a journalist has been
Yes.
also at the forefront of revealing some of this. But, to build on that point, Nora, one of the challenges is you need to have a robust, well-funded media that can go out and do those investigations, come up with, gather the data, et cetera. And we know that generative AI systems are pirating and taking content from news organizations, which are overrepresented in many of the language models because of the value of news data, without license, without compensation, without permission. And I worry that we're entering, we thought the social media era was bad for journalism. We're entering the bloodbath era. How are you guys thinking about this at Free Press? And what do you think, does journalism have a future if, we continue to just let these very valuable companies create more value without compensating not just the journalists, but the creators, the artists, et cetera?
Well, I think we're really in what I would call the chaos era, an era that is marked by one, opacity. And that's sort of been a premise that we've all talked about a little bit, but we have no idea what's really happening within the companies that are in charge of and serve as the primary way that most people get information, social media companies. And those companies are always concerned with profit more than anything. So they're making money off of our eyeballs, off of our behaviors, the data collected about us, and they're not incentivized in any way to produce or curate more credible feeds for each of us. But at the end of the day, we still do not really understand how every single person's feed is different from any other person's. And so in the generative AI context, what that really looks like is the possibility for Courtney to be micro-targeted now with content created really specifically for the behaviors, the attitudes, the little data points that she has engaged in. What groups is she on in Facebook? What likes has she, clicked on? That content then that would be generated for a composite profile that looks like Courtney will then differ from the content that's given to me, differ from the content given to Susan. So then we all get together, right? We're going to be at our happy hour and we'll be discussing an issue of the day. And we all have a different set of facts. We all have a different set of underlying beliefs that have then been based on the facts that we thought were real. That honestly cannot be penetrated by journalistic integrity on a news feed that none of us have any idea who's seeing what. And the companies, as I mentioned, have no incentive to prioritize that because that's honestly not what sells. That's not the sexy stuff. So eyeballs will move towards more incendiary content, which psychologists have over and over found on social media. It creates a loop, as I say at the top, of chaos because whatever Susan is talking about, I'm like, that's not what's happening. I found this. That's a chaotic moment. I don't know if it's just bloodshed necessarily. It's an era that's marked by complete and utter darkness. We have no idea what's happening.
But we're still talking at the individual level. So if we think about the institutional level, the ability of journalism to exist as a field of practice for news organizations to create the profits that they need to do the work. I was speaking with some folks at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project at the Global Investigative Journalism Conference, and they were talking about, they're the ones that did the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. They've recovered like $5 billion in public coffers, led to resignations of people in power who are corrupt. They're paying $20,000 a month for cloud services, which is, for them, it's like a huge amount of their budget, and they're constrained. There's no negotiating power from these, little independent investigative journalism networks or, independent media outlets to negotiate with these very powerful, very wealthy companies. So you've got this power imbalance amplified even more so now that we've talked a lot about the kind of platforms that they're on, but also the underlying infrastructure of the press, not to mention, all of the other creators that are dependent.
Some of that really, I think, speaks to the supply and demand aspect here. And however much we supply people with credible content, we have no real sense of what the demand will be. Will people want and seek out credible journalistic coverage? Again, we have very little insight into that. And we're up against, I think, the infrastructure barriers here are so great that one-off, credible, fantastic, pro-democracy coverage, reaching the people that it needs to reach, we have no sense of how that's happening, if it's happening at scale and in language.
And we probably won't have any idea because of this pervasive lack of transparency, right? And I think one of the key tenets of democracy is accountability and fairness. And it feels like throughout the entire AI stack, from the data that's being collected about individuals, but also on a social and sensorial level, the cloud services, the computational power needed, the talent, there's a lack of transparency. And I think many of the AI fellows on Capitol Hill that are embedded in congressional offices, helping them understand what the problems are funded by big tech. So how do we get out of this, not just online, but also offline, the power of these platforms to shape our democracy?
I want to plead again for systematic oversight. It may not have made sense in the very beginning of the consumer protection scheme for someone outside a company to go and watch what it was doing. Right now, you can't operate a slaughterhouse, for example, without someone who isn't working for the company, coming and watching what's going on inside.
Okay, but I want to push
that. Go ahead.
Push back on oversight. Oversight is important, but oversight comes at the end, right? And the problem I find as a member of civil society, for example, now that we're in the era where tech companies are expected to do consultations, there's the Digital Services Act allows for some auditing and oversight. The auditing, huge burden
under the Digital Services Act. The auditing will be done by companies like Deloitte. It is corporations overseeing corporations. That's not in my view.
So much better. So that's not in your view
not what I'm imagining. And I take your point, Courtney, but I'm also not imagining that the auditing comes, at the end, but rather all the way along the process. I know that there are also proposals for breaking up the big corporations, big tech corporations, to similar to break up some of their power or devolve some of their power. That's a major project. And it seems to me may take a long time. I don't see political will for a major antitrust effort to break up the monopolies in tech. In the meantime,
we are trying to change that.
No, I understand, and by all means. In the meantime, however, there's plenty of damage being done, as you said, very quickly. So I think it's important to try to improve the current situation and the current use of AI, rather than wait until it's possible to take power away from these enormously dominant corporations. Both efforts are necessary, let's say.
And frankly, I'm eager to see what compliance and non-compliance looks like from the DSA. For any single violation, a company may be fined 6% of its annual revenue. That's actually a lot of money, and that's only for a single violation. So played out, if Twitter, we all know how great that's been going, violates the DSA any number of times, that's a massive dent. However, in the US, I think there are a couple of current and exciting steps that we're taking. One of them is the FTC's commercial surveillance rulemaking. It's an effort that began last July, and the FTC is examining what lax data security practices look like across companies, and recommending, and will be recommending, rules for the ways that we rein those lax practices in. One of them has to be by minimizing the data collected about all of us. Data minimization is an easy, low-hanging fruit. We talk about AI because it's the hot topic du jour, but data minimization and data privacy issues are things we've been working on for a long time, and we need a floor. We need a basic floor in the United States so that we understand what data is collected about us, limiting the data that companies can collect, the ways that they then use, analyze, or sell it. We know there's also a relationship of they're selling it to government, so there's a government surveillance component. And we need to, frankly, be able to make easy choices. We haven't talked a lot about design here on this panel, but there's a design barrier, a kind of opacity where we don't even understand often what's being collected about us, or easy ways to opt out of that collection. None of these are rocket science solutions. These are the easiest steps forward, and we need those ahead of 2024, because the less data collected about us is really the less data used to curate and micro-target, often with discriminatory results.
And data is, of course, the basis of these AI systems. Now, my colleague Audrey, did we have any questions from the audience?
Hi. So we have quite a feyou in the theme of looking at legislation that exists, touching on a few areas. The first is the, if you have any thoughts on the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which has been proposed by Senator Klobuchar and Representative Jayapal. And then there's questions as well about, is it too late for privacy legislation to look at issues of data privacy, as well as what it might look like to regulate issues such as deepfakes in the context of elections. So those are broad categories, but what does legislation look like for these topics?
Great. So why don't each of you kind of take, what does legislation look like?
So on one piece that's moving now is we know that FISA's 702 will expire at the end of this year. That is one of the ways that the NSA, the FBI, and others can collect untold amount of data about us. And there are, I think, opportunities for this year for policy solutions that would address, reauthorize, and amend 702. That sounds really wonky. What it really means is putting limits on what government can collect and buy from data brokers and others. It's not the whole problem, but it's one big piece of it. On the commercial surveillance side, like I say, I think the FTC's rulemaking is one of the most promising avenues that we will see. There are a number of proposals that address data minimization, data privacy. ADPPA was the largest and most comprehensive bill, which was introduced last session. It received overwhelming bipartisan support in its committee. It has not been reintroduced this session, much to the chagrin of the entire data privacy field and the digital civil rights field. So that's an area that we're always engaging, trying to push for, particularly ahead of the elections next year.
Kind of ironic that we have limits on what data government can have, but not corporations. Susan, what about you?
The legislature, fortunately, is not the only possibility for rulemaking. As Nora has already mentioned, talking about the FTC, the White House just issued a new executive order on AI, as I imagine most of you know, and it has some very important principles and ideas, including, for example, labeling of AI-generated content. Difficult to implement, but very important, and perhaps there's still time to do some of these things before at least the United States election in 2024.
Great. Well, there are a lot of challenges that AI poses to democracy and freedom of thought, to the collapse of reality. But I think that we are in good hands. And with that, I want to thank our panelists for this discussion and hand it back over to Barry. Thank you.